Imagine you are the captain of a massive 300-meter-long crude oil tanker.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, so it's Tuesday, February 28th, 2026. You're standing on the bridge, looking out over the intensely blue waters of the Persian Gulf.
Right, and you were carrying a lot of oil.
Roughly 2 million barrels of it, exactly. And your destination is a refinery in South Korea. But to get there, you have to navigate the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is, it's a massive maritime choke point.
It really is. At its narrowest, it's just 21 miles wide. So suddenly the VHF radio on your bridge just crackles to life.
Oh, wow.
It's an open, unencrypted broadcast from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And the voice on the radio, well, it doesn't ask for your identification. It doesn't ask for your destination at all.
Let me guess. They just tell you to stop.
Worse. It simply states that, effective immediately, the strait is closed. No vessel is permitted to pass. Any ship that attempts to run the strait, will be considered a hostile combatant and will be set ablaze.
And just like that, with a single radio transmission, the heartbeat of the global economy just skips.
Complete.
We're talking about 20 million barrels of oil a day. That is 20% of the entire global seaborne oil trade, just poof, effectively vanishing from the market.
It is the absolute ultimate nightmare scenario for global trade.
Yeah.
You're suddenly not looking at, like, a jagged red line on a spreadsheet, right? Yeah. Or some simple supply and demand curve.
No, not at all. You are looking at a kinetic, physical disruption of the world's most critical energy artery.
Exactly. We are stepping right into the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. So, our mission for today's deep dive is to really understand this massive, unprecedented global economic shock that's currently unfolding right now in March 2026.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And to do it, we have this fascinating source text document called 1973 _versus_2026_oil_crisis_deep_dive.txt.
Which acts as a really incredible historical mirror.
Right. It compares the ongoing 2026 energy crisis with the infamous 1973 OPEC oil embargo. So the goal of this deep dive is to unpack this source to help you, the listener, really understand what's happening.
Not just the terrifying headlines flashing across your screens, but the actual deep structural mechanics.
Yeah, exactly. What actually happens when the world's oil stops flowing and, what history tells us about what comes next, because this touches everyone.
Oh, without a doubt. It doesn't matter who you are.
Right. Whether you're feeling the absolute pinch at the petrol pump right now, or you're watching your retirement portfolio violently fluctuate, or maybe you're just intensely curious about how these global dominoes fall.
This deep dive will give you those aha moments.
We want to give you the big picture without drowning you in, dense financial jargon. But before we get into the mechanics of it all, we really have to make a very important mandatory disclaimer.
Yes, we absolutely do. The source material we're analyzing today involves highly charged, ongoing political and military events.
Very sensitive stuff.
Right. This includes military strikes launched by the U.S. and Israel under Operation Epic Fury. It involves the assassination of Supreme Leader Khamenei, the retaliatory actions currently being taken by Iran, and various government policies.
Policies from the Whitlam, Fraser, and Hawke Keating governments in Australia up to the current Trump administration in the U.S.
Exactly, along with the shifting geopolitical alignments of various nations. So we need to clearly inform you, the listener, that we are not taking sides here.
No sides at all. We are not endorsing any viewpoints, and we are certainly not validating any of the military or political actions described in the text.
Our job is strictly impartial analysis. We are here solely to report on the economic mechanics and the historical parallels detailed in the provided source material.
We're basically dissecting the engine to see how it works, not, passing judgment on who's driving the car.
Or why they swerved. Perfectly said.
Okay, so to truly understand the massive shock of 2026, we first have to understand the baseline of normal.
Right, the normal that was shattered.
Yeah, the normal that was violently shattered back in 1973. We have to look at the world before that first big oil crisis.
And that world was defined by what the French so elegantly called the Trente Glorieuses.
The glorious 30 years.
Exactly. This was the period from roughly 1945 to 1973. And it is almost hard for us to comprehend today just how incredibly prosperous this era was for the Western world.
Just constant growth, right?
Strong, consistent economic growth year after year. Unemployment was phenomenally low. Inflation was, barely a blip on the radar.
And the middle class was booming.
The middle class wasn't just surviving, it was rapidly expanding. Living standards were rising at a pace that humanity had rarely seen in its entire history.
And this is the key, this wasn't just some magical golden age of pure human ingenuity. It had a very physical, tangible fuel.
It was built entirely from the ground up on cheap oil.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this for a second with an analogy. Imagine the Western economy in the 1960s as this massive, gas-guzzling V8 engine.
I love that comparison.
But it's not just a car. It's the entire infrastructure. Think about the sprawling, car-dependent suburbs in the U.S. that just popped up everywhere after World War II.
And the rise of heavy, energy-intensive manufacturing.
Yeah, and commercial aviation, where middle-class families could suddenly fly across the country. All of those things, the massive highways, the uninsulated homes, the steel factories, they were engineered with the core belief that fuel would literally always cost pennies.
It wasn't just a lifestyle choice to drive a massive Cadillac. The entire economic framework relied on the physical input of cheap energy.
And the entities making sure that energy stayed cheap were the major Western oil companies.
Historically known as the Seven Sisters, they essentially operated as a cartel before OPEC really found its teeth.
So they were calling the shots.
Completely. Through these long-term ironclad contracts with Middle Eastern producing nations, these Western companies controlled the global oil markets. They kept prices artificially low and highly stable.
Like a barrel of oil costs roughly the same as a good dinner.
For decades, yeah. But then the foundation started to crack.
And the crack actually had nothing to do with oil wells running dry, did it?
No, it had to do with paper money.
Let's unpack the 1971 collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary system.
Yeah.
Because this is crucial, and it's a piece of financial history that gets thrown around a lot, but, it's rarely explained well. What exactly happened?
Well, it is the absolute linchpin of the 1970s crisis. To understand Bretton Woods, you have to imagine a global financial system where the U.S. dollar is the ultimate anchor. And that anchor is tied directly to physical gold. Under this system, established after World War II, the U.S. government promised that anyone could exchange 35 U.S. dollars for 1 ounce of solid gold.
So it was a literal guarantee.
Yes. And because the dollar was backed by gold, the rest of the world's currencies pegged their value to the dollar. It created a highly stable, predictable environment for global trade.
All right, so if I'm a country selling you goods and you pay me in dollars, I feel totally safe. Because I know those dollars are basically just receipts for physical gold sitting in a vault in Fort Knox.
Precisely. But by the late 1960s, the U.S. was spending massive amounts of money. I mean, they were funding the Vietnam War and President Lyndon B. Johnson's enormous Great Society domestic program.
So they needed more cash.
To pay for all this, the U.S. was essentially printing more dollars than they had gold in the vaults to back up. Other countries, particularly France, started looking at the math and getting nervous.
They saw the writing on the wall.
Yeah, they started demanding their gold. They handed over their dollars and basically said, give us the gold.
It's the equivalent of a bank run.
Right.
But on a sovereign global scale.
Exactly, a bank run. And by 1971, President Richard Nixon realizes the U.S. is going to run out of gold. So in August 1971, he goes on television and unilaterally ends the convertibility of the U.S. dollar to gold.
He just severs the link.
Completely severed it. This is famously known as the Nixon shock.
So what does that actually mean for the value of the dollar?
Well, without the anchor of gold, the value of the dollar was left to float on the open market. And because there were so many dollars out there, its value plummeted. The dollar was drastically devalued.
Okay, now let's connect this back to oil. If you are an oil-producing nation in the Middle East, say Saudi Arabia or Iran, your oil is priced and sold in U.S. dollars.
Right, that was the standard.
So imagine you're selling me barrels of oil, and for years I've been paying you with these tickets that are tied to gold. But suddenly, the arcade manager Nixon says the tickets aren't tied to gold anymore.
And he prints 1 million more tickets.
Right. The tickets you were holding, the dollars you were receiving for your most precious, finite resource, are suddenly worth a fraction of what they were yesterday. You were getting ripped off.
That is exactly how the oil-producing nations felt. Their purchasing power evaporated. A devalued dollar meant they were receiving less real, tangible value for their oil.
Which obviously created deep resentment.
Massive resentment. It created a furious desire among producing nations to reassert their pricing power and make up for the wealth they had lost to American inflation and currency devaluation.
Enter OPEC.
Right. OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, had actually formed in 1960, but for its first decade, it was relatively quiet. It didn't have much geopolitical muscle.
But the Nixon shock was the tinder. And then, in 1973, someone threw a match.
The match was the Yom Kippur War. In October 1973, a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel.
And Israel struggled initially.
In the early days, yes, Israel suffered heavy losses. The United States, under Nixon, stepped in to resupply Israel, providing a massive airlift of $2.2 billion in emergency military aid and equipment.
And OPEC, specifically the Arab members of OPEC, decided they'd had enough. They weaponized their oil.
In direct retaliation for the U.S. resupplying Israel, the Arab members of OPEC declared an embargo. They completely cut off oil exports to the United States and its allies.
Including countries like the Netherlands, right?
Yes. But they didn't just stop shipments. They actively cut physical production by roughly 25%.
And when you remove 25% of the supply of the world's most critical commodity overnight, the math gets violent.
It was a seismic shock. Within mere months, the price of a barrel of oil quadrupled. It skyrocketed from about $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel.
So when that embargo hit, it wasn't just like an annoying price hike at the gas station where you grumble as you fill up your tank.
No, not at all.
It was an existential threat to that V8 engine economy we talked about. It completely pulled the rug out from under 30 years of infrastructure that had assumed $3 oil was a permanent law of nature.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we need to make a fundamental distinction. When we look at the historical mirror, comparing 1973 to what we are experiencing right now in 2026, the mechanism of the disruption is completely different.
Walk us through that, because on the surface they look exactly the same. Oil stops flowing, prices go up.
On the surface, yes, but the intent is entirely different. The 1973 OPEC embargo was a deliberate, calculated economic weapon. It was a dial that OPEC turned down specifically to exert political leverage.
They wanted to change foreign policy.
Exactly. They wanted to force Western powers to change their foreign policy regarding Israel. It was a boycott.
But the 2026 crisis in the Strait of Hormuz isn't a boycott.
No, the 2026 crisis is a kinetic military byproduct. It is the immediate, chaotic fallout of Operation Epic Fury and the assassination of Iran's supreme leader.
So it's an act of war.
Right. Iran didn't close the strait to negotiate a treaty. They closed it as a retaliatory act of war. One is a political chess move using supply quotas, and the other is active maritime warfare involving drones, anti-ship missiles, and burning tankers.
The mechanism is different, but the economic devastation, the mathematical reality of removing that oil from the market looks terrifyingly similar.
And that economic devastation has a specific name, a name that makes central bankers wake up in cold sweats.
Stagflation. Okay, let's really dive into the anatomy of a supply shock. We've established how the oil stopped flowing, but we need to look at the immediate mathematical consequence of that stoppage. What actually happens to the money?
The mechanism of damage here is a phenomenon economists call cost-push inflation.
Okay, break that down for us.
When we hear the word inflation, we usually think of demand-pull inflation. That's when the economy is red hot, everyone has a job, everyone has lots of cash, and they're all rushing out to buy the same limited number of houses or cars.
Right, too many dollars chasing too few goods. The high demand pulls the prices up.
Exactly. But cost-push inflation is infinitely more sinister, because oil isn't just the stuff you put in your gas tank so you can drive to the movies. Oil is the lifeblood of the physical, material world.
It's in everything.
It is the base input for almost everything. It powers the massive cargo ships that bring goods across the ocean. It powers the diesel tractors that harvest our wheat.
And it's used in manufacturing, too.
Yes, it is the literal base chemical component for plastics, synthetic rubber, asphalt, and perhaps most importantly, agricultural fertilizers.
So when the price of oil quadruples overnight, it's not just the price of a road trip that goes up. The fundamental baseline cost of producing almost every single good and service in the entire economy increases.
Exactly. And this creates a devastating dual blow effect, because simultaneously, this higher cost of oil acts as a massive, unavoidable tax on consumers and businesses.
Let's really map out that tax concept for the listener because it's vital.
Think about a local bakery. In a normal month, the bakery owner spends a certain amount on the electricity to run the ovens, the diesel to fuel their delivery van, and the plastic packaging for their bread.
Say that costs them, I don't know, $1,000 a month.
Right, $1,000. The rest of their revenue goes to paying their workers, buying better equipment, or the owner taking their family out to dinner. But suddenly, the oil shock hits. Now, just to keep the lights on, run the ovens, and fuel the van, it costs $4,000 a month.
Wow. So that extra $3,000 didn't vanish into thin air. Where did it go?
It was transferred directly out of the local economy and sent to the oil-producing nations. It's a massive wealth transfer.
So it drains the local economy.
Money that you, the consumer, or that bakery owner would have spent on going to a restaurant, buying a new appliance, or expanding a business is completely wiped out. It violently drains demand from the domestic economy.
Now wait, I want to push back on this a bit, because if we look at standard textbook economics, there's a balancing mechanism, right?
Theory, yes.
Like if things get too expensive, people just stop buying them. If bread becomes $10 a loaf because the bakery's costs went up, I stop buying bread. I eat rice, the demand drops, the bakery has a surplus, and they are forced to lower their prices back down to find a buyer.
That's how it's supposed to work.
Right. The system is supposed to balance itself. Why didn't that happen in the 1970s? Why did inflation keep skyrocketing while the economy was simultaneously collapsing?
That is the brilliant, terrifying trap of cost-push inflation. Your standard economic model relies on the idea of discretionary spending.
Meaning things I choose to buy.
Exactly. You can choose not to buy a new television. You can choose not to go on vacation. But you cannot choose not to eat. You cannot choose not to heat your home when it's freezing in winter.
And the bakery cannot choose to bake bread without electricity.
Right. So the demand for these basic necessities is highly inelastic. The inflation in the 1970s wasn't coming from a booming, overheated economy with consumers spending freely on luxuries.
It was coming from the absolute bedrock cost of production.
The inflation was baked into the supply side. So as a consumer, you are spending every single dollar you have just on survival gas, heat, basic food. You stop buying everything else entirely.
So the factories making the TVs and cars see their sales plummet to zero.
Yes, they start firing workers by the thousands. But the prices of basics are still skyrocketing because the oil is still expensive.
Which means you have inflation and unemployment rising at the exact same time.
This is stagflation. Economic stagnation, recession, and high unemployment occurring simultaneously with high inflation. For a long time, traditional economists thought this combination was practically impossible.
They thought inflation and unemployment were on opposite ends of a seesaw, right? If one went up, the other had to go down.
The 1970s broke the seesaw, and it creates a complete nightmare for central banks. This is where the structural trap really snaps shut.
Let's explain that impossible dilemma a central bank faces when stagflation hits.
The mandate of a central bank, like the Federal Reserve in the U.S., is generally twofold. Keep inflation low and stable, and maximize employment. Usually they have one main tool to do this: interest rates.
The price of borrowing money.
Great. So in a normal recession, where unemployment is high but inflation is low, the central bank lowers interest rates. This makes borrowing cheap.
Businesses take out loans to build new factories, people get cheap mortgages, it creates jobs.
But in stagflation, if the central bank lowers interest rates to try and fix the massive unemployment, what happens?
They throw absolute gasoline on the inflation fire.
Exactly. By making money cheaper and flooding the system with liquidity, they cause the already high prices to explode even further out of control.
Okay, so they do the opposite. They see inflation hitting 12%, so they raise interest rates to choke it off.
But if they raise interest rates to kill the inflation, they make borrowing incredibly expensive. Businesses stop expanding entirely, mortgages become unaffordable.
And the economy grinds to a halt.
Which means they cause an incredibly deep, brutal recession, putting millions more people out of work.
It's a lose-lose. There is no right button to push on the dashboard. In fact, the source data we are looking at actually quotes former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke on this exact dilemma.
Oh, he summarized it perfectly.
He explained that monetary policy simply cannot offset the recessionary and inflationary effects of an increased oil price at the same time. You literally have to pick your poison.
And historically, in the 1970s, central bankers were terrified of high unemployment. The memories of the Great Depression were still alive.
So they tried to save the jobs.
Initially, yes. The U.S. Federal Reserve chose to try and save jobs by cutting rates to support economic growth. And economists today look back at that and realize it was a catastrophic mistake.
It didn't save the jobs.
No, but it deeply entrenched the inflation, lengthening the inflationary spiral for an entire decade.
The data points from the 1970s are just, they're wild to read today. It feels apocalyptic.
Yeah.
In the U.S., inflation in 1974 hit 12.3%. Unemployment climbed to 9%.
And physically, on the ground, it was chaos.
You had literal gas stations running entirely dry with cars lined up for blocks. People were getting into fistfights over the last few gallons of petrol. The U.S. government resorted to begging the public to turn down their thermostats.
They legally lowered the national highway speed limit to 55 miles per hour, just to increase fuel efficiency.
They even extended daylight saving time just to save marginal amounts of electricity in the evenings. And over in the UK, it was arguably even worse.
Much worse. The UK was hit by the oil shock simultaneously with a massive strike by domestic coal miners. The country was literally running out of energy to keep the lights on.
Didn't they have to declare a state of emergency?
They did. The UK government imposed a mandatory 3-day work week for commercial consumption of electricity.
Let's really visualize that.
Mhm.
A 3-day work week doesn't mean a nice 4-day weekend.
No, it meant factories, offices, and shops were legally prohibited from using commercial electricity for more than 3 specified days a week. There were rolling electricity blackouts across the entire country.
People were working by candlelight.
Television broadcasting was strictly limited and forced to shut off at 10:30 p.m. to conserve power. Germany, Sweden, Italy, the Netherlands, they all plunged into severe, deep recessions.
There's a headline from the Financial Times during this period that perfectly captures the sheer dread of the era. The headline simply read, "The future will be subject to delay."
The future will be subject to delay. It's chilling.
It gives you absolute chills. It perfectly captures that feeling of the V8 engine stalling out. So knowing how catastrophic this was globally, we need to look at how this impossible economic math played out in a specific contained environment.
How it played out down under.
Right, because Australia experienced a uniquely dramatic, almost theatrical version of this 1970s shock.
The timing for Australia couldn't have been more awkward. It was a perfect storm of domestic ambition colliding with global catastrophe.
Set the stage for us. What was happening politically?
In December 1972, Gough Whitlam's Labour government swept into power. This was a massive cultural and political shift for Australia, ending 23 straight years of conservative, liberal Country Party rule.
Whitlam came in with a massive mandate and an incredibly ambitious platform. It's time. That was the campaign slogan.
Exactly. He wanted to drag Australia into the modern era. He had a sweeping platform of social reform, introducing universal healthcare, making university education free, massively expanding welfare and urban development.
He was trying to do a lot very quickly.
He was trying to implement all of this rapid change just as the global tectonic plates were shifting violently underneath him.
And Australia was already losing its traditional economic moorings even before the oil embargo hit in October 73.
Right. Early in 1973, the United Kingdom officially joined the European Economic Community.
Which was a big deal for Aussie trade.
Huge. For over a century, the UK had been Australia's primary guaranteed export market for agricultural goods. But by joining the EEC, the UK essentially abandoned its preferential trade relationship with Australia in favor of Europe.
And the U.S. was pulling back too, right?
Simultaneously, the U.S. economy was weakening under the strain of the Vietnam War and the collapse of Bretton Woods, which meant U.S. foreign investment into Australia was dropping sharply.
So the storm clouds are already gathering, the economic engine is sputtering, and Whitlam's government, seeing early signs of inflation starting to bubble up, does something that is just mind-blowing in retrospect.
The secret tariff cut.
Yes. Walk us through exactly what this was and why it is so legendary.
It is a remarkable piece of political history and a masterclass in how well-intentioned policy can backfire disastrously if the timing is wrong. In a desperate bid to fight off the rising inflation, Whitlam formed a tiny, highly restricted committee.
Kept it totally hush-hush.
They met in total secrecy in an obscure location in Canberra. They intentionally bypassed the traditional bureaucracy. They didn't even consult the Treasury Department.
Which is usually unheard of for a major economic decision.
Completely unheard of, and the decision they made. At 7 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in July 1973, Whitlam simply announces to the nation that, effective at midnight, there will be a 25% across-the-board cut to all import tariffs.
25%, just slashed overnight. Let's explain what a tariff is and how cutting it is supposed to fight inflation, so we understand their logic.
Sure. A tariff is a tax that a government places on imported goods coming from other countries. It makes foreign goods more expensive, which protects local, domestic manufacturers from being undercut by cheaper foreign labor.
And tariffs were high in Australia back then.
Astonishingly high. Up to 55% on imported clothes and textiles, and 45% on imported cars.
So if a shirt from Asia cost $10, the Australian government slapped a $5 tax on it, making it $15. so that the local Australian shirt factory could sell their shirt for $14 and stay in business.
Exactly. The logic behind Whitlam's secret cut was that by slashing that tariff by 25%, a flood of cheaper foreign goods would enter the country.
The Asian shirt now only costs $12.
This forces the local Australian factory to lower their prices to compete. By forcing prices down across the board through international competition, Whitlam believed he could crush inflation before it really took hold.
Okay, the logic is sound on paper, it's structural reform, but let's look at the timing and the execution. It's like
Yeah.
deciding that your house feels too dark and closed off, so you decide to knock down a massive load-bearing wall to open up the floor plan.
A risky renovation.
Right. Now, opening the floor plan might be a brilliant idea in the long term for the value of the house. But doing it in total secret without consulting your architect, the Treasury, is incredibly risky. And doing it right as a Category 5 hurricane, the 1973 OPEC oil shock, is making landfall.
That is a recipe for the roof to collapse entirely.
Exactly. How did this actually play out in the Australian economy?
The roof collapsed. While the tariff cut was applauded by many academic economists at the time, and it undeniably laid the groundwork for Australia becoming a more competitive, open economy decades later, the short-term reality was utter economic turmoil.
Walk us through the causal chain. How does a tariff cut combine with an oil shock to cause a crisis?
Step 1. The tariff is cut. Immediately, a tidal wave of cheaper imported goods floods into Australia. Consumers, quite rationally, start buying the cheaper imports instead of the locally made goods.
Which means the local factories suddenly see their sales drop off a cliff.
Exactly. Step 2. Local businesses, manufacturing, textiles, automotive parts, suddenly lose their cash flow. They can't pay their debts. They start laying off workers.
And the banks notice.
The banks see these businesses struggling and panic. They severely tighten lending, refusing to give out loans. This creates a massive credit squeeze.
And where do primary producers like farmers fit into this?
They get caught in the crossfire. A beef farmer, for example, relies heavily on short-term credit to buy feed and equipment before the slaughter season.
But the banks aren't lending.
Right. With the banks panicking and the global economy shuddering from the oil shock, short-term interest rates hit astronomical levels. The farmers couldn't afford to borrow money to run their farms.
So you have a credit squeeze, rising unemployment from the factory closures, and on top of that, the government starts pouring fuel on the fire with wages.
This is where the Whitlam government compounded the problem severely. They believed that the public sector government employees should act as a pace-setter for wages. They granted massive pay increases and better conditions to public servants.
But when you do that, the private sector unions look at the government workers and say, hey, we want that too.
Precisely. It drove wage expectations wildly across the entire economy. Unions demanded huge pay spikes to keep up with both the public sector and the rising inflation.
And Australia had a highly centralized wage-setting system at the time, right?
They did, which meant these massive pay increases became legally baked into the economy. Average earnings in Australia jumped an astounding 29% in 1975 alone.
A 29% wage increase in 1 year. For any business owner listening to this, imagine your payroll costs jumping 30% overnight. What do?
You have to raise prices.
You have to raise the prices of your goods just to cover payroll, which causes more inflation, which causes unions to demand more wages. It is a textbook, inescapable wage price spiral.
And when businesses resisted those wage demands, the industrial relations environment broke down completely. More than 6 million working days were lost to union strikes in 1974 alone.
The economy ground to a halt.
Inflation hit 17.6% by mid-1975. The trade deficit blew out by $1.5 billion because imports surged by 30% after the tariff cut, while exports stalled.
But as we look at the data, there's a really weird counterintuitive anomaly here. Globally, the price of a barrel of oil went up 255%. But if you were a guy driving a Holden Kingswood in Sydney in 1974, you weren't actually feeling that full blast at the petrol pump. Why not?
Because Australia employed a policy of heavily regulating its domestic crude oil prices. At the time, Australia was producing a decent amount of its own crude oil domestically, particularly from the Bass Strait.
So they didn't have to import everything.
Right. The government forced those domestic producers to sell their oil to Australian refineries at a fixed, artificially low price, well below the exploding global market price.
So the government essentially built a financial wall to shield the consumer.
They did. While global oil surged 255%, Australian retail petrol prices only rose by about 22% during the initial shock. It acted as a magnificent shield for consumers and businesses in the short term.
But I'm guessing that shield came with a massive hidden cost.
It was a disastrous double-edged sword. By shielding consumers from the true painful cost of energy, the government completely removed any financial incentive for fuel conservation.
So Australians kept driving massive cars and burning cheap petrol, completely out of step with the global reality.
Exactly. Even worse, it destroyed the incentive for domestic exploration. Why would an oil company spend hundreds of millions of dollars drilling a risky new well in Australia if the government forces them to sell the oil at a fraction of its true global value?
They wouldn't. Exploration ground to a halt.
Australia didn't wake up to reality and introduce import parity pricing, meaning pegging domestic oil prices to the actual global market price until 1978.
Which brings us to the real underlying diagnosis for Australia in the 1970s. The core issue wasn't just the oil shock itself, it was that Australia lacked what economists call shock absorbers. Let's explain what that means.
Think about driving a car over a massive pothole. If you have good suspension shock absorbers, the car bounces, but you maintain control and keep driving.
But if you don't,
If you have rigid, solid iron axles with no suspension, the impact cracks the axle and the car crashes. In 1973, Australia had a rigid iron axle economy.
detail those rigidities. What was missing?
First, they had no independent reserve bank to manage monetary policy objectively. The government basically controlled interest rates, and politicians rarely want to raise interest rates and cause pain before an election.
It makes sense.
Second, they had no medium-term fiscal strategy. They spent money reactively. Third, and most importantly, their exchange rate was fixed.
Meaning the value of the Australian dollar was pegged.
Right. The currency couldn't drop in value to act as a pressure valve to absorb international shocks and make exports more competitive. Finally, they had that centralized wage setting system, which legally baked the inflation into the economy via the wage price spiral.
So when the global oil shock hit, the massive pothole, these domestic policy mistakes were magnified tenfold because the system was rigid. It couldn't flex to absorb the energy, it could only shatter.
And shatter it did. This economic chaos led directly to the unprecedented political chaos of 1975, culminating in the constitutional crisis when the Governor-General literally dismissed the Whitlam government from power.
But ironically, there is a silver lining. This fiery, chaotic crucible taught the next generation of leaders some harsh, permanent lessons.
Yes, the historical data points out that future Australian leaders, specifically Bob Hawke and Paul Keating in the 1980s and 90s, learned from Whitlam's ghost.
They realized that you can have massive reformist ambition, but it absolutely must be paired with strict, ironclad economic discipline and structural flexibility.
They floated the dollar, decentralized wages, and gave the Reserve Bank independence. That realization physically reshaped modern Australia. The agonizing lessons of the 1970s built the resilient economic architecture that Australia relies on today.
But here's where we need to make a massive, terrifying pivot. Because as we look at the data and jump back to the present day, to the unfolding crisis in March 2026, we discover a shocking reality.
The game has changed entirely.
While the underlying mathematical mechanisms of cost-push inflation and supply shocks remain exactly the same as they were in 1973, the geographic map of who actually gets hurt has entirely flipped.
It is a stunning reversal of vulnerability.
This is one of those profound aha moments that completely reframes how you look at the news. Let's recap the exact trigger for the 2026 reality we are sitting in right now.
On February 28, 2026, the U.S. and Israel launch Operation Epic Fury. The supreme leader of Iran is killed.
And in immediate, furious retaliation, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps closes the Strait of Hormuz.
The geography of the strait is crucial here. As we mentioned, it is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and the actual shipping lanes are only 2 miles wide in each direction.
It's a tiny bottleneck.
It is arguably the most strategically important artery in the entire global economy. By closing it with anti-ship missiles, mines, and drone swarms, Iran immediately dropped tanker traffic by 95%.
20 million barrels of oil a day vanishing in a single stroke.
And the global energy markets reacted with immediate violence. Brent crude oil, the global benchmark, broke through $100 a barrel for the first time in 4 years. Within a week, it peaked at $126 a barrel.
That is a 45% increase from pre-conflict levels. And it wasn't just oil, was it?
Natural gas shot up 55% because Qatar, a massive exporter of liquefied natural gas, sits inside the Persian Gulf, and their facilities were struck in the crossfire. Agricultural fertilizer jumped 35% almost overnight.
But here's the incredible paradox about who is suffering. The data points us to the concept of the inverted map.
If you look back at 1973, the West was the primary intended victim. The United States, Western Europe, and Japan bore the absolute brunt of the pain because their economies were fundamentally reliant on importing cheap Middle Eastern oil.
But look at the United States in 2026.
The United States in 2026 is fundamentally insulated. Thanks to the shale revolution over the past 2 decades, the U.S. is a net energy exporter. They produce enough domestic oil and natural gas to meet their own baseline needs.
Now, because oil is priced globally, a spike to $126 still means American consumers are paying painful record prices at the local gas pump, right?
It hurts, absolutely. But it is not an existential systemic threat to the American macroeconomy in the way it was in 1973. They aren't going to run out of physical fuel to run the military or the power grid.
And what about China, the other massive superpower?
China is also somewhat insulated, though differently. While they import massive amounts of oil, they have aggressively maintained a heavy reliance on domestic coal production for their baseline power grid.
And they have pipelines, too.
Right. They have secured overland pipelines from Russia that bypass the maritime choke points. They have strategic vulnerabilities, but they have shock absorbers.
Think about this profoundly for a second. The U.S. and Israel started this military operation, Epic Fury. But the United States economy is structurally insulated from the worst of the fallout. So who are the real victims in 2026? Who is taking the direct hit?
The absolute epicenter of the devastation is the fast-growing Asian economies. In 2024, an astonishing 84% of all the crude oil flowing out of the Strait of Hormuz was destined directly for Asian markets.
They're the ones addicted to Gulf oil today.
Exactly. Let's look at the specific data points for these Asian nations because it paints a picture of terrifying vulnerability. Japan depends on imported fossil fuels for 87% of its entire energy needs, and a staggering 95% of its crude oil comes straight from the Middle East.
That is massive exposure.
South Korea is equally exposed. They push 68% of their total crude imports through the Strait of Hormuz. And then you look at developing nations like Vietnam. Vietnam operates with fewer than 20 days of strategic oil reserves on hand.
Let's pause and role-play that for a second. If you are a policymaker in Vietnam, and the strait closes, you have exactly 20 days before your power grid fails, your trucking fleet stops moving food, and your country grinds to a literal halt.
20 days to find a massive alternative supply of energy in a market where everyone else is panicking.
It is practically impossible. That is the ultimate geopolitical irony of 2026. It is a deeply asymmetric shock.
The military action was initiated by Western allies, but the absolute devastation of the economic fallout is landing squarely, heavily on Asia. They're the collateral damage.
And you can see the panic immediately reflected in their financial markets.
The equity wipeouts were historic. Within days of the closure, Japan's Nikkei stock index fell 8%. South Korea's KOSPI index dropped 11%, falling so fast it triggered an automatic circuit breaker.
Explain a circuit breaker really quickly for the listener.
Think of a circuit breaker in a stock market like the fuse box in your house. If there's a massive surge of electricity that could cause a fire, the fuse trips and shuts the power off to save the house.
It stops the trading.
Right. If prices plummet too fast driven by pure panic selling, an automatic computer system halts all trading for a set period. It forces the traders to stop, take a breath, and evaluate the actual math instead of just panic selling into a void.
The fact that the KOSPI triggered a circuit breaker tells you exactly how terrified the Asian markets are of a closed Strait of Hormuz.
And we have to recognize that the transmission of this panic is so much faster and more complex today. We aren't just dealing with oil tankers. Supply chains in 2026 are hyper-optimized webs.
What is happening to global shipping right now?
Total chaos. Major global shipping conglomerates, companies like Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, and MSC, have looked at the burning tankers in the strait and completely suspended all transits through the region.
So where do they go?
They are rerouting their massive container ships around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope.
Which is a massive detour.
It adds weeks to delivery times and adds astronomical costs in extra fuel and insurance. The cost to ship a standard container from Asia to Europe has quadrupled. And furthermore, it's not just iPhones and sneakers on those ships.
Right, up to 30% of global fertilizer exports originate in the Gulf and transit Hormuz.
So this isn't just an energy crisis anymore. The UN estimate suggests this is rapidly evolving into a looming global food crisis. Without those fertilizers arriving in Asia and Africa in time for planting season, crop yields will inevitably fall.
We are looking at massive spikes in global food prices 6 months from now, baked into the system today.
Which brings us to a highly specific, terrifying scenario outlined in our historical mirror data regarding Australia. Because Asia is the epicenter of the economic damage, and modern Australia is intimately tied to Asia economically, Australia faces a completely different threat compared to its 1973 experience.
Let's talk about the 5-week ticking clock.
This is where Australia's modern vulnerability lies. Today, Australia no longer imports large volumes of raw crude oil directly from the Middle East. If you just look at a high-level spreadsheet, that sounds like brilliant news. It sounds like they are insulated.
But they aren't?
No, because over the past 2 decades, Australia made a critical structural choice. They closed almost all of their domestic oil refineries. They decided it was cheaper to import the finished product.
So where do they get it?
Today, Australia relies almost entirely on importing already refined fuel, ready-to-use diesel, petrol, and jet fuel from massive mega refineries located in South Korea and Singapore.
And here is the fatal flaw in that supply chain. Where do South Korea and Singapore get the raw crude oil to make that diesel?
From the Middle East, through the Strait of Hormuz.
Precisely. So Australia's vulnerability is entirely indirect, but it is absolute. The refineries they depend on are being starved of crude. And here's the truly alarming data point that the text highlights. Right now, in March 2026, Australia only holds about 5 to 7 weeks of strategic petroleum reserves.
Let me put that in context. The International Energy Agency mandates a strict 90-day minimum reserve of imported oil for all its members to survive exactly this kind of geopolitical shock.
And Australia just doesn't have it.
Successive Australian governments were warned about their paltry 5-week reserve for years. Think tanks, military strategists, and economists repeatedly waved red flags, but governments essentially ignored the warnings because building massive fuel storage tanks is expensive and politically unglamorous.
And now the clock is ticking. Let's visceralize this. I want to role-play this 5-week clock. If you were looking at the data, what does a diesel shortage actually look like as it bleeds into a modern economy week by week?
The transmission mechanism is rapid and it is brutal. Road transport accounts for 85 to 90% of all land freight movement across the massive Australian continent. The logistics network consumes 10 to 12 billion liters of diesel every single year.
Okay, so week 1 of the crisis.
Week 1, the strait closes. Panic buying begins. Retail prices at the pump jump 50 cents, then $1. Trucking companies suddenly see their operating margins vanish overnight. Some smaller owner-operators just park their trucks because it costs them more to deliver the freight than they get paid.
Week 2.
Week 2, the South Korean refineries announced they are slashing diesel exports because they have no crude coming in. The Australian government realizes they are burning through their 5-week reserve. They have to institute emergency rationing.
Logistics companies are told they only get 70% of their normal diesel allocation, which means 30% of the freight simply stops moving. Week 3. What stops first?
Non-essential goods stop first. Building materials, retail clothing, consumer electronics sit in warehouses. The government prioritizes diesel for emergency services, hospitals, and basic food distribution. But the cost of moving that food skyrockets.
And this leads us to the massive, terrifying dilemma that the Australian government is staring down right now, perhaps by week 4 or week 5. The mining sector.
The data reveals a staggering vulnerability. The Australian mining sector, iron ore, coal, critical minerals, operates massive diesel-hungry machinery. Those giant haul trucks in the Pilbara consume 40% of the nation's entire diesel supply.
40%. So I want to ask you directly, if you are sitting in the cabinet room of the Australian government right now, looking at the spreadsheet, knowing you have roughly 2 weeks of fuel left, how do you even begin to solve the dilemma of mining versus food? Who gets the diesel?
It is the ultimate nightmare scenario for a policymaker. You have to choose your catastrophe. Mining is Australia's largest export sector. It is the absolute bedrock of government revenue and corporate profitability.
If you cut the diesel allocation to the massive mines in Western Australia,
The mines shut down. Iron ore exports to Asia stop. The Australian economy crashes into a severe recession, the Australian dollar collapses on foreign exchange markets, and the federal budget is gutted.
but the alternative,
If you choose to keep those export-heavy mines running to save the macroeconomy and the currency, you have to find that diesel somewhere else, which means you are actively diverting vital, rapidly dwindling fuel supplies away from the domestic trucking networks.
You are restricting the trucks that bring fresh food to the grocery stores, the trucks that deliver medicines to regional hospitals. You are literally choosing between national insolvency on one hand and empty grocery store shelves and domestic unrest on the other. It's an agonizing lose-lose. The structural rigidity is terrifying. But let me ask, is there any silver lining for Australia in 2026? Is there a shock absorber that Whitlam didn't have?
There is one highly significant financial buffer. Unlike in 1973, modern Australia is a massive exporter of liquefied natural gas, or LNG. Remember we mentioned earlier that Qatar's massive LNG facilities inside the Persian Gulf were struck during Operation Epic Fury?
Right.
When those facilities were struck, Qatar declared force majeure on their LNG deliveries to Asia.
Let's explain force majeure really quickly.
It's a standard legal clause in massive contracts, essentially meaning an act of God or an unavoidable catastrophe. It allows a company to legally break their contract and stop delivering gas without being sued because their facilities were literally bombed. It's out of their control.
So Qatar stopped shipping gas. Asia is suddenly desperate for energy to keep their power grids from collapsing.
Exactly. And who is the other major global supplier of LNG sitting right on Asia's doorstep, completely outside the conflict zone? Australia. Because of the crisis, Australia's LNG export revenues are surging to absolute record highs.
Asian buyers are paying exorbitant premiums to secure Australian gas. So while Australia is paying painfully high prices to import refined diesel, they are making absolute fortunes exporting LNG.
Yes, that massive influx of export revenue acts as a vital financial buffer at the macroeconomic level. It softens the blow to the national balance sheet. Furthermore, as we discussed, Australia today has those vital shock absorbers it learned to build after 1973.
The Independent Reserve Bank.
Yes, an independent RBA to manage inflation objectively. It has a floating Australian dollar, which acts as an automatic adjustment mechanism. As the global economy panics, the Aussie dollar drops in value, which actually makes their other exports more competitive globally.
And crucially, no centralized wage-fixing system to accidentally trigger another 29% wage price spiral. The economy is flexible.
The suspension is good, but the road is still full of craters because the global baseline they're working from is still incredibly fragile. The historical data makes this extremely clear. Before this crisis even erupted on February 28th, the global economy was teetering.
We had just spent 3 years fighting the post-COVID inflation spike, meaning global interest rates were already sitting at elevated restrictive levels. Europe had barely recovered from the massive energy shock caused by the Russia-Ukraine war, and their strategic gas storage is sitting at a precarious 30% capacity right now.
So even with better economic tools, global policymakers have very, very little room to maneuver.
That underlying fragility is exactly what makes the geopolitical situation so incredibly combustible. Because while the economic fallout is severe, the data points out something even more profound and permanent happening right now in the waters of Hormuz.
The actual foundational rules of global trade are actively being rewritten.
Let's look at this closely, because that's where the 1973 comparison really diverges into new territory. Section 6 of the dynamic we are analyzing focuses on geopolitics and what experts are calling the death of freedom of navigation. We need to emphasize again that what is happening right now in the Strait is not a political embargo where men in suits sit in Vienna and announce production cuts.
It is a literal, chaotic war zone.
It is a kinetic conflict with live munitions. Iran has made 21 confirmed physical attacks on merchant shipping vessels. We have seen a Greek-owned oil tanker struck by a ballistic projectile, tragically killing crew members.
Another massive container ship was hit by an explosive drone boat. The physical peril to civilian mariners is intensely real. In response, the United States military is conducting sustained aerial campaigns to try and force the Strait open, targeting Iranian naval assets, radar installations, and shore-based anti-ship missile batteries.
The Trump administration has issued a very stark 48-hour ultimatum.
Yes. Threatening to drastically escalate by striking mainland Iranian power plants and critical infrastructure if the Strait isn't opened. But here's the critical geopolitical fracture. The international coalition is completely fracturing.
Most traditional U.S. allies in Europe are explicitly refusing to join the kinetic military effort, terrified of a wider regional war. And concurrently, the Houthi forces in Yemen are threatening to massively escalate their attacks on the Red Sea choke point if the U.S. pushes further into Iran.
It's a powder keg. But here is the most insidious, calculating part of Iran's strategy, according to the strategic analysis. They aren't just blindly shooting at every single ship that approaches. It is a highly selective blockade.
Iran is actively safely allowing ships from friendly or neutral nations, like China, India, Pakistan, and Turkey, to pass through the strait completely unharmed. Meanwhile, they are violently, completely blocking any vessel that is Western affiliated, whether by ownership, flag, or destination.
They are actively setting up a formal vetting and registration system for maritime traffic, which is an entirely unprecedented move in modern maritime history.
I love the analogy we discussed earlier for this. It's exactly like a bouncer at a high-end nightclub. But the nightclub is international waters, and the velvet rope is a gauntlet of anti-ship missiles.
The bouncer has a VIP list, and that list is based entirely on who is diplomatically aligned with Tehran. You get your massive oil tanker to the velvet rope of the Strait of Hormuz, and if your government isn't friendly with the IRGC, you don't get in, you don't get your oil. You are turned away to sail around Africa. And if you unpack the mechanics of that velvet rope, it goes beyond just shooting missiles. It extends into the invisible world of maritime insurance. Lloyd's of London and other massive insurance syndicates look at a Western ship trying to enter the strait and say, "We will not insure you. The risk is 100%.
If a ship has no insurance, it legally cannot enter most global ports. So the velvet rope isn't just military. It becomes an impenetrable financial barrier erected by geopolitical alignment.
This raises an important question. What might be the most important question of the decade for global trade? Are we witnessing the definitive end of post-World War II freedom of navigation?
For 80 years, the fundamental, unquestioned assumption of the globalized economy has been that the oceans are free for commercial transit. The U.S. Navy has essentially acted as the global guarantor of that freedom.
But Iran is successfully erecting a toll booth. They are charging a literal geopolitical tax for passage through international waters. This crisis is physically fracturing the global energy market into rival, segregated geopolitical blocks.
The global oil market is no longer a single, unified pool divided simply by the invisible hand of supply and demand. It is being violently physically divided by diplomatic alignment.
Exactly. The era of pure globalization, where economics trumped politics, is over. The Strait proves it.
So what does this all mean? Knowing how these massive tectonic pieces are currently falling across the board, from the inflation trap to the fracturing of global trade, we have to look to the long-term historical precedents. We have to look at the 1970s to see where this all leads. What comes next for us in 2026?
The overarching analysis identifies one key, supreme variable that will dictate the severity of everything that follows: duration. How long does the Strait of Hormuz actually stay closed? The Dallas Federal Reserve has run the macroeconomic models. They project that even if the closure is relatively short, lasting only 1/4, 3 months, global GDP still drops by a massive annualized 2.9%. That is a deep, painful global recession.
But what if the diplomacy fails?
Well,
What if the military campaign bogs down and the closure persists into the summer?
then it gets catastrophically worse. It morphs from a logistical nightmare into a structural disaster. Because eventually, the Gulf-producing nations, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, who are still pumping oil but cannot put it on ships, will physically run out of places to store it.
Every tank, every pipeline will be sold to the brim. When that happens, they will be forced to shut down their production wells entirely. Shutting in a massive oil well isn't like turning off a faucet. It physically damages the reservoir.
So a temporary shipping choke point mutates into a structural long-term deficit in global oil supply that will take years to fix.
And we know from the 1970s that the pain of an energy shock has an incredibly long tail. Think about the timeline. The actual 1973 OPEC embargo only lasted 5 months. It ended in March 1974. But the economic devastation, the rampant inflation it unleashed lasted nearly an entire decade. It fundamentally haunted the global economy until the early 1980s.
It did, and it only ended when the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, made an agonizing, brutal choice. To break the back of the entrenched stagflation, Volcker jacked interest rates up to an astonishing 20%.
He intentionally, deliberately forced the American economy into a brutal, crushing recession. Millions of people lost their jobs, businesses went bankrupt, but it was the only way to finally kill the inflation monster.
So the lesson for 2026 is terrifying. Even if U.S. military or frantic diplomatic efforts manage to open the Strait of Hormuz tomorrow morning, the economic damage, the inflation, the supply chain realignments, the wealth transfer is going to echo through our lives for years.
However, we also have to recognize that crises are the ultimate catalysts. They violently accelerate megatrends. The 1973 shock was deeply painful, but it birthed the modern world.
It forced the rapid development of non-OPEC oil sources, like the massive platforms in the North Sea. It forced Western governments to create strategic petroleum reserves. It pushed the sleepy automotive industry towards smaller, highly fuel-efficient cars.
And on a macro scale, it accelerated the rise of Asian manufacturing, as Western corporations desperately sought cheaper labor alternatives to offset their exploding energy costs.
So what does this historical mirror tell us about the megatrends of 2026? How will this crisis reshape the next decade? It means we are about to see a violent, unstoppable acceleration of the trends we've been quietly discussing in boardrooms for years.
First, you will see a massive, forced shift to renewable energy and nuclear power. Not just for environmental reasons, but for pure national security. Nations now realize viscerally that relying on imported fossil fuels routed through a maritime choke point is a lethal existential vulnerability.
A solar panel on your roof can't be embargoed by a foreign navy. Exactly. Second, you are going to see a dramatic acceleration of what economists call friendshoring. Corporations and governments will move critical supply chains, microchips, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, out of potentially hostile or neutral nations and locate them only in countries they geopolitically trust.
The efficiency of globalization is dead. The resilience of friendshoring is the new mandate. And thirdly, you will see countries frantically, aggressively expanding their strategic commodity reserves.
Which brings us back to the tragedy of Australia's 5-week reserve. Successive governments were warned repeatedly. Think tanks practically begged them to build more storage, and they did nothing.
It took a literal war in the Middle East and the genuine threat of domestic rationing to force the issue.
Human nature rarely fixes the roof while the sun is shining.
There's also a fascinating, highly specific note in the historical data about gold. It's a great case study in market psychology. In the 1970s, during that decade of stagflation, geopolitical dread, and pure uncertainty, gold acted as the ultimate safe haven. The price went from $35 an ounce in 1971 to an astonishing $850 an ounce by 1980.
But in the 2026 crisis, the immediate pattern is eerily complex. Gold initially spiked on the news of the geopolitical shock, but then it violently crashed. Why did the ultimate safe haven crash during a crisis?
It was a pure liquidity panic. Let's explain the mechanism of a margin call, because that is what drove the crash. Imagine you are a massive financial institution. You have borrowed billions of dollars to invest in various complex markets, maybe energy derivatives or foreign currencies.
When the energy markets went absolutely haywire after the strait closed, your investment started plunging in value. The banks that lent you the billions of dollars suddenly call you up and say, your investments are tanking. We need you to deposit $500 million in cash into your account by the end of the day, or we are seizing everything. That is a margin call.
So if I'm that institution, I need cash right now, today.
Exactly. You are desperate for cash. So what do? You don't try to sell your complex, illiquid real estate or your plummeting stocks. You sell your most liquid, universally accepted asset. You sell your gold.
So everyone rushes to sell their gold at the exact same time just to raise emergency cash to cover their debts.
Yes. The sheer volume of selling crushes the price. We saw this exact same pattern during the acute phase of the 2008 financial crisis and again during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020. Gold crashed 30% during the acute panic phase.
But here's the crucial takeaway. Once that initial liquidity scramble subsides and the systemic reality sets in, gold rebounds massively. In 2008, after the initial crash, gold more than doubled over the next 3 years.
The historical analysis suggests that if stagflation truly sets into the global economy in 2026, once this initial margin call panic clears, gold's fundamental drivers, runaway inflation, intense geopolitical dread, and a profound loss of faith in fiat currency, are poised to make it soar to unprecedented heights.
It's all about watching the second and third order effects, which is exactly what central banks are doing right now. They know all of this. The current governors, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the RBA, they have read the history books. They intimately know the 1970s playbook.
Which is precisely why they will act very differently this time around. In the 1970s, as we discussed, central bankers initially lacked the resolve to crush inflation. They tried to save jobs and let the inflation run rampant. Today, central bankers are absolutely terrified of repeating that historical mistake. The data indicates they will err violently on the side of fighting inflation.
Which means
Which means they will actively, deliberately induce a near-term recession. They will keep interest rates painfully high, deliberately slowing down the economy, raising unemployment, and crushing demand, because they firmly believe that a short, sharp, brutal recession today is the only possible way to avoid an entire, agonizing, lost decade of stagflation tomorrow.
the overriding lesson across all these decades is crystal clear. Absolute energy dependence on a single region or a single 21-mile maritime choke point is an existential vulnerability.
It is a vulnerability the modern world can no longer afford.
It's incredible how much ground we've covered today, but the parallels are absolutely undeniable. We've seen exactly how the terrifying mechanics of cost-push inflation from the 1970s, that creeping, inescapable tax on survival, are haunting the global economy right now in 2026.
We've unpacked the profound irony of the inverted map, how the vulnerability has flipped entirely from the West suffering in 1973 to the fast-growing economies of Asia being the chief victims of collateral damage today.
And we've walked step by step through the chilling reality of how a 21-mile stretch of water is currently holding the entire global supply chain and quite possibly the global food supply completely hostage.
It reveals just how fragile the illusion of abundance really is. We built a world assuming the engine would never run out of cheap fuel.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, there is one final, intensely provocative thought that emerges from our historical comparison that I want you, the listener, to really mull over. It's a concept that ties everything we've discussed together into one massive geopolitical question. In the 1970s, the oil crisis birthed a financial structure we call the petrodollar recycling mechanism.
It is the bedrock of modern finance.
Essentially, because all oil was priced in US dollars globally, the OPEC nations amassed trillions of these dollars during the 1970s price spikes. But they couldn't spend them all domestically, so they took those massive dollar reserves and reinvested them straight back into Western banks and U.S. Treasury bonds. This mechanism effectively crowned the U.S. dollar as the undisputed, unassailable king of global trade. Every nation on Earth needed dollars to buy energy.
It cemented American financial and geopolitical hegemony for half a century. It gave the U.S. unprecedented power.
Exactly. But look at the mechanism of what is happening right now. In March 2026, Iran is actively forcing an energy market that is bifurcated entirely by diplomatic alignment. They're allowing nations like China and India to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, likely settling those oil trades in Chinese yuan or Indian rupees, or via bilateral barter agreements outside the Western financial system. Meanwhile, they are actively blocking the West, forcing them to route around Africa or rely on domestic reserves.
They are physically and financially splitting the market.
If energy markets physically fracture into rival geopolitical blocs, trading on different terms with different access, using different currencies to avoid Western sanctions and insurance embargoes, we have to ask a massive paradigm-shifting question. Is the 2026 crisis not just the terrifying return of stagflation? Is it the beginning of the end for the petrodollar itself?
If the foundational commodity of the global economy, energy, is no longer universally traded on a single, unified, dollar-dominated market, the downstream effects on global finance, on U.S. borrowing power, and on Western economic dominance are almost incalculable.
It brings us right back to the beginning. We aren't looking at a clean X-ray with a simple, easy-to-fix fracture. The machine itself is broken, the waters are deeply, dangerously muddy, and the economic structures we all assumed were permanent, the foundations of the world we've lived in since the 1970s, might just be washing away in the waters of the Persian Gulf. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep a very close eye on the data, watch the shipping lanes, and we will catch you next time.